When our bodies feel like crud, we recognize it as our body feeling like crud. But when our brain is feeling like crud, we don't necessarily recognize the same. Maybe we feel like we have less cognitive function, but we also forget that the brain is central to how we feel in our body. If our brain isn't feeling good, our body doesn't feel very good either. Okay, so when you look at the short and the long-term molecular integrity of our brain, you do need to take a serious look at what you're eating, because there are foods that negatively impact our brain. They negatively impact the chemical response within our brain, and they negatively impact our neurons, and we need to take a look at what they are. So let's go ahead and dive into the foods that are negatively affecting our cognitive behavior, cognitive function. The first one is one that's a little bit obvious, but we have to look at the data either way. Sugary drinks and refined starches. What's interesting here? Well, there's a study that was published in the British Journal of Nutrition. It took a look at 803 participants. Now, in this case, they were type 2 diabetics, which means they didn't process glucose very well. Well, what they did is they gave them diet soda or regular soda or water, and they wanted to see their overall mental response, their cognitive response, just to a battery of different neuropsychological tests. Well, they found that those that had soft drinks with the sugar in it had a decrease in spatial memory, a decrease in working memory, decrease in what's called scanning and tracking, and worst of all, a decrease in what is called executive function, which is like the prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe, overall just executive function, just like the name implies. What was wild was that there was not an effect negatively with diet soda. Now, that doesn't mean that you go out and drink a couple of liters of Diet Coke or something. The point is that the short-term effect very seemingly was coming from the sugar. Okay, so let's expand a little bit more, because there was also a study that looked at what's called high fructose corn syrup, which is a higher concentration of fructose along with sucrose as well. This was interesting. This was published in the journal Hippocampus, and it took a look at spatial memory, but it also took a look at neuroinflammation. Now, in this particular case, they were looking at rats. So full disclaimer, I always disclose when it is a rodent model study, because it's not the same, but it's still what we do when we're trying to look at mechanisms. So they gave these rats standard rat chow plus water plus 11% high fructose corn syrup compared to chow, water, and 11% sucrose. Okay, so high fructose corn syrup versus sucrose. Then they used a maze. They literally put them through a maze to measure their neuropsychology and to measure their overall just how quickly they were able to perform tasks. Well, they found the high fructose corn syrup severely impacted spatial memory, okay, whereas the sucrose did not as much. Still affected it, but nothing like the high fructose corn syrup. Now, spatial memory is being able to create a mental image of your environment. So a maze is like a perfect demonstrator of that. If you cannot figure out where you are, spatial memory is probably something that's important. They also saw that there was an increase in what is called neuroinflammation. So they had more inflammation specifically in the dorsal hippocampus, which is related mainly to memory, visual memory, some degrees spatial working memory. But anyway, the point is they had an increase in inflammation there, which can definitely affect how the neurons communicate with one another and how the synapses are really effective. Okay, so the way that you get around this is, well, honestly, eat less of the refined starches, eat less of the sugar. If you want an alternative, if you still like sweet things, I put a link down below for something called Lakanto. Now, I wanted to get something out there in the open. Lakanto is a sponsor on this channel, but there's a lot of products out there that are sort of like knocking off Lakanto and trying to create something similar. Lakanto has a really interesting technology. Just want to hear me out on this. Okay, with their technology, it is an erythritol grain that is spray coated with monk fruit. So that means the monk fruit sweetening effect that you're getting is evenly coated. Like if you compare that to, say, the Splenda monk fruit that's out there. Like if you open that up and you smell it, it tastes and smells like really weird. It's got a very artificial, weird taste, and the granules are really inconsistent. Okay, that makes it very hard if you're baking with it or if you're trying to mix it, because you don't necessarily know the level of sweetness that you're getting. The other ones, there's the Whole Earth, which is the one that you're gonna see a lot of times at Costco and things like that. Same kind of thing, like really inconsistent with the granules. So you've got an erythritol granule and then some monk fruit, and you've got like random little granules of each, versus Lakanto having the erythritol that is coated in the monk fruit. So a completely different ball game. And then you've got some other brands out there. You just have to really look. That's the nice thing I do like about Lakanto, is they're like the OG in the space that has really done this well. So I put a link down below. They have a variety of different products. They have chocolate peanut butter cups, like really good stuff. They have miniature cookies. They have baking mixes like brownie mix, like pancake mix. They have their traditional sugar alternative. Anyhow, just a plethora of different things. So if you're trying to kick the sugar and you're trying to kind of impact yourself that way, check them out. So that link is down below, and that'll save you a couple of bucks if you want to use that link. So down below in the description, you drop that little arrow down, you'll see that link for Lakanto. So don't be fooled by a lot of the imposters that are out there. They really are the OGs in the space. Next up is going to be heavily processed food in general, but mainly things like sauces, chips, noodles, and fried foods. We know that these are not exactly good for our waistline, but what are we talking about when it comes to the brain? Like, do we have any concrete evidence? Nothing in science is concrete, okay? Things always change. But there's a study that was published in the journal Nutritional Sciences. This looked at 18,080 people, so over 18,000 people, and it was analyzing different diets, different subsets of like foods, and how it affected cognitive function. Well, with this, when they investigated all this, they were able to break down that it looked as though the southern diet, okay, from like the southern states, seemed to be the worst with cognitive function. So foods that were characteristic of like high fat, high saturated fat, heavily processed, and what do you know, also a lot of sugar. There's probably also a lot of canola and a lot of soybean oil because there's so many fried foods, and those are usually fried in not the best oil. So a lot of moving pieces here, but still, the southern diet was associated with lower verbal memory and verbal learning, but it was also associated with lower executive function. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone that lives in the South is living like this. That's not the point. The point is, when you look at regions and you look at the kinds of foods that are categorized, this is what they saw. Now, it's not so much about the individual things, it's probably about the collective, right? The collective effect of heavily processed, heavily fried, high saturated fat, high vegetable oils that are adulterated and are manipulated, and high amounts of sugar. I like observational studies. I like big studies. It tells us a lot. But I also like mechanistic studies to learn about what's going on. So there was a study that took a look at rats that showed us a little bit more of the mechanisms of what could be going on here. It was published in the journal Hippocampus, and it looked at the same kinds of foods that are in the southern diet. And they gave them 8 months of this kind of diet. Okay, and they found that there was a decrease in dendritic spine density, which we'll talk about in just a second what that means. But there was also a reduction in spatial learning and a reduction in long-term potentiation and a reduction in brain-derived neurotrophic factor. What the heck does this really mean? Okay, well, spatial learning and spatial memory, as I talked about, is the ability to create a mental image of your environment. So if that decreases, that's just situational awareness and everything goes down. So what happens is the brain fires messages between neurons, okay? And between these neurons, you have what are called synapses. And these synapses are where chemical messengers cross through that gap to another neuron, to a dendrite, to be able to send a message. Okay, so when you have less dendritic density, or spine dendritic density, or dendritic spine density rather, you have less potential communication gaps. So let's say there were 10 bridges crossing from an island to the mainland, 10 bridges, okay? And chemical messengers go across those bridges. Okay, you're getting a lot of signals across, a lot of communication. Now you have less dendritic spine density. Okay, you have 5 bridges instead of 10. 5 of the bridges just got blown out. Now you have much less communication occurring, much less overall signal, much less activity happening with the synapses. Now long-term potentiation is the more longer-term solidification of this process. So those synapses are where the chemical messengers go across. Okay, but those synapses need to go to the gym, and they need to get stronger, and they need to get better. The stronger the synapse, the faster the communication can go across. Okay, so the synapses are weaker. So long-term potentiation was decreased in rats in this hippocampus study. Okay, so that shows us quite a bit there. And then of course the BDNF, that's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which plays a tremendous role in how our brain grows and develops. And if BDNF is low, you could imply that, well, brain growth and ultimately death can occur, right? Brain growth stops or slows down and brain death could potentially occur. A lot of evidence in the world of BDNF and how it helps out with neurogenesis and how it helps out with building up the strength of those neurons, the strength of those synapses, those signals. The next one is alcohol. Now we know at surface level that alcohol is going to impair us, and when we're drunk it's not exactly good for our brain at that time, right? But what about a longer term effect? Well, there's a study that was published in Alcohol and Alcoholism that took a look at 48 alcoholics, people that were consuming a lot of alcohol regularly. They have interesting standards for that. It actually wasn't too much in the way of alcohol to be considered alcoholic in this case, but 48 of those and 36 people that were healthy, non-alcoholic. They found that those that were alcoholic had a significantly worse attention span and much less executive function. 2 characteristics that are very much so driven by the prefrontal cortex, by the frontal lobe. So with that, we need to look at more data. We need to look at some neuroimaging. So there's a study that was published in the journal Alcoholism that took a look at the neuroimaging to see what's going on within the brain in the brain of someone that is an alcoholic. They found that there was a reduction in both gray and white matter volume. So the gray matter is like the processing hub of all of this, okay? The gray matter is going to have the cell body, it's going to have the dendrites, and then you have the white matter. The white matter is much more for the axons. Point is, if you have a decrease in gray and white matter, you have a decrease in the overall matter that contains all of these important attributes. Okay, so you have less brain, literally, less brain. But they also found that there was a reduction in neurotransmitter activity. So remember the bridges I was talking about? Well, those chemical messengers that jump across the bridges to send signals, those chemical messengers are neurotransmitters. So not only do you now have less potential bridges, but you also have less or possibly impaired or dysfunctional neurotransmitter activity. So maybe they're just not jumping at all, or maybe they're jumping and going somewhere else. There can be some huge potential issues there. So we do know that short-term alcohol isn't good, and I think we know generally, systemically speaking, that alcohol long-term isn't good. But if you've noticed a decline in your brain over the years and you are someone that drinks a fair bit, it's something you might want to consider looking at. Now, I do want to touch on one more thing that is still in the rodent model world, okay? If you start looking at hypothalamic gene expression in mice, there is some pretty daunting stuff coming out surrounding soybean oil and canola oil, okay, and how it can affect the hippocampal region of the brain, how it can affect the hypothalamus. Essentially, there was one study in particular that was looking at like oxytocin levels and this and that. They were trying to kind of determine some other things, but what they ultimately found was that there were some interesting pathways that were indicative of leading to neuroinflammation. The reason I bring this up is I cannot say with concrete detail that soybean oil or canola oil are going to negatively impact your brain. But when you start looking at the neuroinflammation links, it's something you have to pay attention to. So I want to mention one thing on neuroinflammation. Think about those same signals, those same synapses, right? And those neuromessengers or chemical messengers jumping across, the neurotransmitters. Okay, now I want you to imagine it's really foggy out. Okay, and that same bridge I've been talking about, those neurotransmitters now just can't really jump because it's like thick pea soup fog and they just can't really send the communication. So that electrical signal is just like, it's like a lightning storm happening in a fog storm, like a bunch of fog, a bunch of lightning, and like where's the actual lightning bolt? The electricity is all cattywampus. So neuroinflammation is not a good thing. So whenever we start seeing heavily linked foods with neuroinflammation, it's something we have to be cautious with. And I say this not because you should avoid soybean oil and canola oil 100% at all costs, never ever touch it or you're gonna just end. I just look at like the Southern diet, which we picked apart a little bit, and how much soybean oil and canola oil is used. And I feel like the overconsumption of it could definitely be a problem. So even when we start looking at rodent model studies, the doses they're giving rodents, it probably equates similar to like some of the crazy doses that some people have. Okay, some people consume a copious amount of it. So just use caution. Okay, so sugary drinks, high fructose corn syrup, swap it out for things like Lakanto and just get that stuff out of your life and the cravings go away too. So chips, sauces, noodles, that whole Southern diet, the fried foods, that whole kind of processed food stuff. Okay, alcohol, absolutely be careful of, and the canola oil and the soybean oil. So as always, I'll see you tomorrow.